What is clear is that China is a decisive enabler of Russia's war against Ukraine. China is upholding Russia's war economy, and China is delivering the components, the microelectronics, the microprocessors that Russia is using to build the missiles and the bombs they're using against Ukraine.
The first thing for you to listen to, just at the very beginning of this, is how Jens Stoltenberg described what he called his worst moment as Secretary General.
The full-scale invasion of Ukraine, we were not surprised because we knew exactly what was going to happen, but we were shocked, and it was terrible to see.
He's obviously discussed the current situation with that war then. And there appears to be, doesn't there, a bit of an impasse with Washington over the use of Western long-range missiles by Ukraine into Russia. And before I get you to answer your first question, this is Stoltenberg's response to whether he feels that Vladimir Putin's threats that NATO would be at war with Russia if it allows that to happen are what is actually holding Joe Biden back from saying yes.
There's a full-scale war going on in Europe, and there are no risk-free options in a war. But I believe that the biggest risk will be if President Putin wins, because then the message is that when he uses military force, he can get what he wants. Second, it's wrong to say that NATO allies will be party to the conflict if they allow their weapons to be used against legitimate targets on Russian territory. North Korea and Iran are providing significant military support, providing missiles, drones to Russia without them becoming directly party to the conflict.
So the first question, Larisa, is that the first time we've heard Stoltenberg using NATO, or insist that using NATO long-range missiles in Russia will not mean that they have a direct involvement in the war? And how much pressure would Stoltenberg and NATO be pushing on Biden to allow this to happen?
Well, this has become sort of a major issue over the last few days. If you remember, we had the trip by Sir Keir Starmer to the White House to meet Joe Biden and discuss the issue of Storm Shadows and other long-range weapons last week. And then we're hearing from Jens this week. So it is his first sort of big comments on the issue. And what he's saying is obviously interesting. He's saying that he's welcomed decisions by allies previously to lift restrictions on various pieces of equipment. There have been previously lots of discussions over sending just aircraft and sending tanks and sending the weapons in the first place. So he's indicating that he's supportive of this notion that the US should approve the use of long-range weapons inside Russia. And that's obviously what President Zelensky of Ukraine has been telling allies that they need to be able to do in order to actually have a significant impact and change things on the battlefield. And so I think you can kind of gather from that Stoltenberg's, is on the side of the Ukrainians, but he doesn't want to go too far because obviously it is up to each individual ally what they decide to do on this matter.
And he was then pushed on it a little bit further with Stoltenberg and asked, quite bluntly, whether he thinks, as a lot of NATO member leaders do, that Putin's claims on this are actually a bluff. And I'll play you his answer now.
There have been many red lines declared by him before, and he has not escalated, meaning involving NATO allies directly in the conflict. And I think that reflects the fact that if he wanted that conflict, of course, he could have decided to escalate long before. He has not done so because he realizes that NATO is the strongest military alliance in the world.
So, Larisa, that sort of suggests to me, without explicitly saying it, yes, I do think he's bluffing. And actually, he's gone a bit further, hasn't he? Almost is calling the bluff of Putin and saying, you're never going to go that far.
Yes, that's exactly how I read it. And you know, Putin, this is all sort of about Putin's comments last week, because Putin said that if allies did say that the West could use these long-range weapons inside Russia, then they would be at war with Russia. And Stoltenberg's making the point that actually you've already had Iran supplying missiles to Russia. They supplied these FAF 360 ballistic missiles to Russia just a few days ago. And Iran has also been supplying drones. North Korea and China are also accused of helping to prop up Putin's war efforts in Ukraine. And none of those countries are believed to be, you know, directly at war with Ukraine or with the West. And so Stoltenberg is effectively saying that, yes, you know, he said there's been these red lines before, nothing's happened, and he's suggesting that nothing would happen again. It's quite difficult territory to get into, but obviously there are concerns by countries like the US that if they did approve this use of long-range weapons, then you know, Putin might escalate things by using tactical nukes inside Ukraine, or carrying out a cyber attack, or doing something else that frightens the West. But in reality, you know, Putin knows that if he went too far, then he would actually end up with you know, in a war with the West, and he obviously wants to avoid that. And as Stoltenberg says, you know, he's not going to win any type of war with NATO or any nuclear war.
Now, obviously, that's something was still a bit of an unknown, whether those long-range missiles will be allowed to be used in Russia. But one thing is for certain is that there are currently Ukrainian boots on the ground in Russia. And Stoltenberg was asked about the Kursk invasion and whether he believes that it's been a success. So that's the next clip.
Ukraine has achieved important operational goals. They have demonstrated their offensive capabilities. They have created some uncertainty in Moscow, and they have boosted their morale of the Ukrainian armed forces and the Ukrainian people, and they have inflicted heavy losses on forces and taken many prisoners. Then, of course, it's too early to say, because war is unpredictable by nature, and I will not give a kind of final judgment on that operation. What I can say is that I have confidence in the judgment of the Ukrainians.
So I guess he's effectively saying, isn't he, that, you know, it's up to the Ukrainians to determine when and if it has been successful. I guess that might only ever be seen if and when we end up with peace talks, mightn't it? Because, you know, this is kind of about leverage.
Yeah, it's pretty tricky at the moment to make an assessment on it. I mean, the Ukrainians had hoped to pull a significant number of Russian troops away from the Donbass region and, you know, protect their Russian towns and cities in the east. And that hasn't happened to the degree that they had hoped so far. The Russians have been able to continue their assault inside Ukrainian territory. And I think from that point of view, the Ukrainians are going to be a bit disappointed with this Kursk operation. It has stretched their troops, whereas the Russians are able to throw more troops in every day. In fact, we had this assessment from the MOD's Defense Intelligence Assessment Unit recently, and they were saying that the Russians were able to provide 1,000 soldiers a day to the war, which the Ukrainians aren't able to do. But there has been some positives of the Kursk operation. You know, it's had a huge impact on Ukrainian morale generally. It's sort of changed the dynamic. It's embarrassed Putin. And of course, as Stoltenberg points out, the aim of all of this is to sort of show Putin that he can't just sort of get away with what he wants, and try and bring an end to the war by forcing Putin effectively to a negotiating table, which the Ukrainians hope will lead to Putin to actually pulling out of Ukrainian territory. But of course, we're not going to see whether this sort of master plan works until much further down the line.
And in terms of sort of further down the line, you know, Stoltenberg was asked about, you know, the end game, and specifically whether we've already reached the time for a negotiated peace settlement, and his response, as always, was interesting.
It's for Ukraine to decide when the conditions are in place to sit down with Russia to reach an end to this war. I don't believe it's possible to change Putin's mind, but I believe it's possible to change his calculus. Putin's ambition is to control Ukraine, and he believes that he can achieve his goal on the battlefield. So we must demonstrate that that's not the case by providing support to Ukraine. Because when Putin realizes that he cannot win on the battlefield, then the likelihood for him being willing to sit down and accept that Ukraine prevails as a sovereign independent nation increases.
Larisa, it crossed my mind when I heard that answer, and he sort of said that is up to Ukraine. That right from the start of this conflict, we've talked about different sides, different parts of NATO and Ukraine itself will potentially have different views of what winning this war is. So I wonder whether behind closed doors, NATO will have been quite as, well, we let Ukraine decide, when and how this ends, as he's suggesting there. And similarly, I wonder whether it is as much in NATO's interest to have this end sooner rather than later as it is in Ukraine's, is it?
I mean, I've spoken to a lot of people about this issue over the last few days, and I think what's interesting is Starmer went to see Biden in the White House to discuss the end game for Ukraine, and Zelensky wasn't present in those meetings, so there were a lot of discussions going on in the sidelines that aren't actually involving the Ukrainians. And yes, everybody tells you that officially that it's up to the Ukrainians to decide this, but actually other nations are ultimately going to be putting pressure on the Ukrainians if they feel that the time is right. Now, at the moment, I think that the focus actually is on giving Ukrainians sort of the tools to really try and push the Russians out of their territory and also have a successful operation in the Kursk region, sort of before the winter months set in and before it gets extremely difficult for the Ukrainians to fight back. And so I think it's all about trying in the next few months to get the Ukrainians into a good position in reality, so then they can try and force Putin to the table. But actually, if you try and talk to anyone on the record about peace talks, then it's very difficult to get any European diplomats or Americans talking about peace talks, because they're afraid that just doesn't help the Ukrainians at all and sort of plays into Putin's hands.
Okay, so that's the sort of specifics on Russia and Ukraine. The other parts of the interview with Jens Stoltenberg concentrated maybe a bit more on the wider impact of the Russia-Ukraine conflict, and as well sort of more generally on the future. And I found this comment really interesting when Jens Stoltenberg was asked what worries him about the future.
I'm always very careful predicting what the next crisis will be, because no one has been very particularly successful in predicting the crisis in the past. So instead of trying to foresee the unforeseen, I think we should be prepared for surprises. I do not know what the next crisis will be, but what I do know is that if we stand together in NATO, we will be able to tackle those crises. We will be safe.
Larisa, there is a lot of weight on the word if there, isn't it? And I'm trying to think what scenario Jens Stoltenberg might have been thinking about when he used that word if. And I'm wondering whether it might be the outcome of the US presidential election or if there's something else as well.
Yeah, I mean, when we were putting these questions together, I think when we asked this, when we had this one prepared, we were thinking you might talk about, the rise of China or the fact that the conflict in the Middle East could escalate. And I found it quite fascinating here that he sort of says that it could be a complete surprise. And I was thinking, oh God, where else are we going to see conflict? It's quite a terrifying remarks, really. But yes, in terms of the US election, obviously there's a lot hanging on who's going to be in power. And if it is Donald Trump, then that is going to concern his successor in NATO, because obviously Trump has suggested that he might even pull out of NATO, or he wants Ukraine to have a peace deal straight away and give up land, and it's just all very unclear what Trump might do. And I think a lot of leaders are actually trying to get some of these decisions out of the way now before Trump, if Trump does get in, because they want to make sure that they're Trump-proofing NATO is the word that's been described, because they want to make sure that they're still helping the Ukrainians. Even if Trump gets in, it'll be harder for him to sort of disentangle the US from any of those plans.
Now, having said that, and I realise this is ever so slightly a tangent, because we don't know about that outcome. He was also asked specifically about an Article 5, wasn't he? An Article 5 being, if a member nation is attacked, then all of NATO comes together to defend that nation. And he was asked how confident he was that the alliance, the accord, would hold. And specifically Hungary was mentioned relating to this, because, with Viktor Orban, so I don't know whether you could say he's aligned with Russia, but would Hungary fight against Russia if Russia was to attack a NATO member? And again, the response, it was unequivocal, actually.
Absolutely, and that has been so clearly stated again and again by NATO allies, and demonstrated not only in words but also in deeds, by significantly increasing our military presence in the Eastern Part Alliance, increased readiness, more defense spending, all of this to remove any room for miscalculation and misunderstanding in Moscow about our readiness to protect and defend all allies.
Are you as confident as Jens Stoltenberg is that an Article 5 would hold and that all members would rush to all other members' aid if needed?
I think it would really depend on the situation. Viktor Orban has remained, he's kept this sort of close-ish relationship with Putin throughout the war. And he went to Moscow in the summer to meet him, despite clearly going against the wishes of other leaders. People weren't happy about this sort of building relationship that he's got with Putin. And I don't know, because he's also raised concerns about the idea that NATO might be expanding its reach, and he doesn't want Hungary to get involved in missions that are outside of NATO's territory. So I think we would have to see exactly what the circumstances would be. If Putin does something that's a bit sub-threshold, he carries out a cyber attack against a NATO country, or something else that could be perhaps deniable, Viktor Orban might have a bit of a different view about the response to that than some of his friends in NATO. So obviously Stoltenberg has to say that they'd all act together and in harmony, but I'm not sure if that would actually be the case in practice.
So Stoltenberg, at least publicly, insisting a sort of solid NATO, but he's also shared concerns about almost, I guess, an autocratic equivalent, hasn't he, involving North Korea, Iran, Russia, and China.
So we see how authoritarian powers are aligning more and more, and we see that clearly demonstrated in the war, in Russia's war against Ukraine, where they all provide significant military support to Ukraine. But we also see how Russia and China have signed agreements, how they exercise more together, how they patrol, have joint naval and air patrols. So we see how they diplomatically support each other, and also the fact that China has not condemned the brutal invasion of Ukraine. So yes, they are more and more aligned.
Larisa, how much intel do you think goes into an answer like that? How much can we really truly know about what goes on in talks between the countries that were mentioned there?
I think probably quite a significant amount. There's a lot of stuff that we haven't been told in terms of sharing of sensitive information and technology and military equipment between those nations and Russia. I can think of a few examples where Grant Shapps, the former defense secretary, told us that he believed China had been supplying lethal aid to Russia, but then we never got the details on what that was. There's been a lot of discussion over recent days about Iran obviously have supplied these ballistic missiles to Russia, and the question is, what's Russia given Iran back? And there's some talk about the Russians may have given them some sort of information that may help with Iran's nuclear weapons program. And Stoltenberg didn't get into that exactly. But he'll be seeing a lot of information, a lot of it top secret. And there are similar warnings that we've received by other people in governments and in the military. And the most notable one I can think of was General Sir Rowley Walker, who is the new head of the army. And he told us in a briefing around the summertime that he feared that these four nations, he called them an Axis of Upheaval, working together more closer than ever, and they continue to do so. And he was pretty terrified of the idea that in 3 years' time, the West needed to be ready to take on all of those countries, because he believed that the risk was so intense.
Yeah, I think we spoke about that at the time, didn't we? You've jumped the gun on me ever so slightly with your answer there, because you mentioned this suggestion that perhaps could Russia be offering Iran technology that could help with its nuclear weapons program. So I'm just going to play the clip here of what Stoltenberg actually said regarding that.
Russia is not getting this for free. Yeah. We are concerned that there may also be possible that Russia is sharing technology that will help Iran with their missile programs. But anyway, Russia is then paying for what they get, and that is strengthening Iran's capabilities.
So a refusal specifically to confirm or deny that is what he believes Iran is getting in response to it providing Russia with weaponry. A simple question, I guess, what else might Iran be getting from Russia if it isn't that?
Well, he sort of avoids the nuclear question, but he does talk about the Russians helping with potentially a missile program. We just don't know exactly what missile program he's talking about there. It could be linked to nuclear weapons, or it could be linked to their development of the ballistic missiles. In terms of sort of other things, it's a pretty difficult one to answer, really. Nuclear weapons are going to be sort of the key factor for the Iranians, but I'm sure there's lots of other stuff that they're going to be able to share with them, maybe sort of intelligence gathered from the battlefield in Ukraine, or intelligence gathered on allies, equipment that they've managed to seize from the battlefield in Ukraine that might have been donated by the West. I'm sure there's lots of stuff that Iran would want to get their hands on, and I'm sure that Western intelligence officials will know a lot more than what's being said out in the public domain.
And I'm about to ask you a similar question about China, because Stoltenberg was asked, is it possible that China is offering Russia weapons? And then, there's this intelligence that suggests that Russia in return might be giving China some sort of help to develop their advanced submarine, missile or stealth capabilities. And this is what Stoltenberg had to say on that.
So what is clear is that China is a decisive enabler of Russia's war against Ukraine. China is upholding Russia's war economy, and China is delivering the components, the microelectronics, the microprocessors that Russia is using to build the missiles and the bombs they're using against Ukraine. First of all, Russia is mortgaging its future to Beijing, and are, of course, not getting this for free. But I am not in a position to go into the details of what kind of technology Russia is sharing with China.
Quite a lot in there, isn't there? Russia mortgaging its future to Beijing, and also I thought for him to say he's not in a position to go into detail. Does that tell you that he knows something that he can't say? I'm sure there's a lot of things he can't say that he knows, but is he doing that there, or is he saying I'm not in a position because we're still not fully clear ourselves? So I guess question one, how far is Putin taking a risk with as Stoltenberg says, mortgaging Russia's future to China? And secondly, then, how much do you think Stoltenberg really knows about that situation?
Yeah, I mean, he obviously talked about specific components, and these aren't sort of big pieces of weaponry or anything. They're parts that can be used inside bombs and missiles, and maybe that's perhaps what Grant Shapps was talking about when he talked about lethal aid being sent from China to Russia. What we haven't seen is the weapons that are being sent, and the people like Bill Burns, head of the CIA, and the MI6 chief Richard Moore are going to be looking very closely at any intelligence that suggests that China's taken that next step to actually supply them with weapons, because then that would be another big escalation in all of this. In terms of sort of Stoltenberg, knowing the detail, he will be privy to some of it. He won't be privy to perhaps everything that maybe Washington's seeing right now. I don't know, but he really is hinting there that there's a lot more that he could talk about, but obviously doesn't want to get into at this moment.
And now this interview with Stoltenberg, unsurprisingly, I guess if you're the head of NATO, particularly at this current moment, was all a bit unhappy, wasn't it? All a bit miserable. But he was asked finally, whether there were any positives, whether there was a sort of golden moment for him over the decade he's been in charge.
There have been many golden moments. The most fundamentally, NATO has prevented for any military attack against a NATO ally. That's a big achievement every day, and that's NATO's core task. We are there not to fight the war, but to prevent the war, and we do that every day by providing credible deterrence, sending a message to all potential adversaries that an attack on one ally would be an attack on all, and by that we prevent war. So that's a constant golden moment. Then, of course, for me as Norwegian Secretary General of NATO, it was great to welcome Finland and Sweden, two neighbors, into the alliance. And a few years ago, hardly anyone expected that to happen. It happened, and that's good for NATO. It's good for Finland and Sweden, and it sent the message to Putin that he's getting exactly the opposite of what he wanted. He wanted less NATO. He wanted NATO to close his door. Now he's getting more NATO.
Yeah, I mean, obviously he was going to put a sort of positive spin on his time, inevitably. I guess a simple question to you then, he's outgoing in, I think it's 13 days at the moment that we're speaking to each other. Would you say that his decade as NATO General Secretary has been a success?
Wow, that is a tough question to answer. I mean, it's so hard to define success, because obviously the last few years since Russia invaded Ukraine, it's people have talked about it. We're at this sort of most dangerous moment since the end of the Cold War, and we're hearing pretty scary things about what the future could hold. And I mean, he's right that in terms of no NATO country's been invaded, but it's all looking pretty bleak at the moment. I'm not sure what he himself could have done differently. Obviously, there has been a lot of disagreements with regards to when Trump was in power and him sort of criticizing the alliance. So it's not all been sort of plain sailing for Stoltenberg. But he's very respected in that position. That's why he's been extended for so long. And I think he will, walk away thinking that he's managed to unite NATO as much as he could. And yes, he's right that no NATO countries have been invaded, but obviously Ukraine is in a pretty horrific situation as it stands.
And just finally, Larisa, he sort of declined within our interview, didn't he, to offer any advice to his successor. I wonder if you can at least give us a sense as to what the new Secretary General's initial challenges will be. What impact could he make immediately? And also, how difficult or easy might that be in the event potentially of a Trump presidency in the US?
I think he's going to have to try really hard to make NATO, appear united when it comes to Ukraine, because obviously we have had these clear disagreements over the use of long-range weapons and whether they should be allowed in Russia, with the UK wanting to change the rules so Ukraine can use them, and the US, President Joe Biden being hesitant. There's also obviously a lot of question over the future funding for Ukraine and the continuation of supplying weapons. Again, he's going to have to continue to convince allies to be in it for the long haul, really. If we aren't going to see any peace deal this year, which seems pretty unlikely that Putin's going to want to agree to pulling out of any Ukrainian territory, then he's going to have to convince allies to keep on supplying those weapons when actually allies are struggling, because a lot of them, and especially the UK, have got hardly any weapons left. They've given a lot to Ukraine. So I think Ukraine's going to be a huge focus for him. And also, obviously, if Trump does get in, he's going to have to be persuading allies to spend more on defence, because Trump, there have been suggestions that Trump might even call for the alliance to increase their defence spending target to 3% of spending, which would be an incredibly tough target for many countries. And so I think that's going to be another thing that will be playing on his mind. And then also there's this sort of look at the Indo-Pacific region and whether NATO needs to sort of have a bit more of a view on what's going on with China. How far does it actually sort of meddle in the Far East, as it were, and try and have a presence there? So I think that's going to be another issue for him. So he's going to have a lot on his table, I think, when he gets into the job.